Hey friends, welcome to today's video. If you hear people talking about white privilege and systemic racism as being a problem in 2020 in the West, then you can normally mark those people down as the true racists. It's my firm conviction that white privilege is just white supremacy rebranded. All these calls for equity are really just calls for a return to race-based discrimination. Don't believe me? Well, perhaps you're not familiar with critical theory. In today's session, I want to explore how everything in our culture has become so obsessed with race. In our day and age, the conversation about race and racism has become so confusing. You have people promoting ideas like, black people can't be racist. People of color may hold prejudices and discriminate against white people, but they lack the social and institutional power that transforms their prejudice and discrimination into racism. It's from the book White Fragility. In our conversation about race, you've got people saying things like, all white people are racist. Hashtag yes, all white people. Society is racist. Capitalism is racist. To love capitalism is to end up loving racism. To love racism is to end up loving capitalism. The conjoined twins are two sides of the same destructive body. Do-nothing climate change policy is racist. COVID-19 is racist. COVID-19 coronavirus. Racism within New Zealand health system. It's killing our people. So how do we get here? How do we get to the point today where everything is labeled racist? Well, I want to show you today how the ideas of critical theory have fundamentally shaped our entire conversation around race. I want to show you how the ideas we explored in the first video have shaped our culture's views and how we might respond. As we get started here, it's very important to recognize that critical theorists are functioning off a definition of racism that is very different to what you might expect. So what is racism? Here is a basic Christian definition of the sin of racism. Ethnic pride or superiority, ethnic hatred, and partiality. Ethnic pride is thinking that someone is superior to someone else because of the arbitrary factor of race or ethnicity and acting accordingly. Ethnic hatred is thinking that someone is inferior or less worthy or less dignified or less valuable than others because of their ethnicities and acting in ways that reflect this belief. And then partiality, treating people differently in an unjust manner because of their race or ethnicity. For the longest time, this has been the general definition of racism that society has used. Under this definition of racism, we have resisted all kinds of evils. It's racist to call someone the N-word because it reflects a hatred for someone based on their ethnicity. It's racist to allow only whites into university because this is unjust partialism towards that group at the expense of others. Under the old definition, we can even have systemic racism in a sense. This would be something like the Jim Crow laws in the US. These laws were racism on a systemic level. The laws and customs of the society reflected a hatred of blacks and an ethnic pride among whites. To support these laws would make one complicit with a racist system. But what we need to recognize is that none of this is what is meant by the critical theorists. Even though they use the words racism and systemic racism, they mean something altogether different. You'll remember from the first video in the series that critical theory has a predetermined commitment to the assumption that society is formed of hierarchical power systems that perpetuate inequity through oppression. What this means in terms of racism is that racism isn't an event or action perpetrated by individuals. Rather, racism is simply the way powerful races interact with oppressed races. Racism is seen as the status quo. It is ubiquitous, meaning it's everywhere and always working to benefit the oppressors. If we view the world through the lens of critical theory, we can't help but see racism. If we begin by assuming that society exists as a complex system of power structures, then we're not asking questions like, does racism exist in every single interaction? Instead, we're asking, how does racism exist in every single interaction? The question for white people is not, am I racist? Instead, it is, how am I racist? Robin DiAngelo says this: racism is a structure, not an event. Racism is a system into which I was socialized. Racism is unavoidable, impossible to completely escape. Interrupting the forces of racism is ongoing, lifelong work, because the frameworks conditioning us into racist frameworks are always at play. Our learning will never be finished. You see, since racism is perpetrated on a group level and not on an individual level, racism therefore becomes absolutely inescapable. By virtue of being born into a dominant group, you are considered to be a beneficiary of privilege, and therefore you're contributing to a racist system. If you're born to a dominant group, you are racist. If you're white, you are racist. However, if you're a person of color, you cannot be racist under this new definition. It doesn't matter if you have ethnic hatred towards whites, or if you think that the black race is superior, or if you believe in discrimination laws. Since you're a part of a marginalized group, you can't be racist, according to critical theorists. Renee Edo Lodge, in her book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, she says this: there simply aren't enough black people in positions of power to enact racism against white people. Do you see the difference between those two definitions? The traditional definition of racism and the critical theory definition of racism. It is very important to see these differences as we move forward. Now, one of the things that happens when this framework is embraced is that a moral asymmetry is created. What I mean is that some actions are only considered bad when committed by people who are white, but they aren't considered bad when people of color do the exact same thing but in reverse. And this moral asymmetry is something that we see big time in our culture. Scholarships for brown students are good and right, but scholarships for whites only would be universally shunned. Schools for brown kids are great, but no one could even imagine a school for whites only. You've got people like Benedict Cumberbatch getting cancelled for accidentally saying colored actors instead of actors who are people of color. Meanwhile, New York Times writers can post stuff like this and face almost no backlash. Just read one of these tweets. Are white people genetically predisposed to burn faster in the sun, thus logically being only fit to live underground, like groveling goblins? Faced almost no backlash. This critical theory framework is why the New York Times can publish trash like this. Opinion: can my children be friends with white people? Or why Vice can publish this nonsense. What it's like to take a vacation away from white people. Here's a question. Would any of this be okay if it was reversed? Of course not. But to the woke, this is not racist, but the reverse would be. And this is no exaggeration. They state it explicitly. J.C. Lee in Race and Postmodernism says this: we can never predict whether an action will be racist or anti-racist solely from its content. Did you get that? We can't know whether someone is being racist or anti-racist simply by the content of their actions. In order to know whether or not the actions were racist, we first need to know the color of the people involved, and that will shape our judgments. If you let race determine your hiring practices, if you hire people based on their race, is this practice racist or anti-racist? Well, according to the critical theorist, we can't know an answer to that question until we know what color you are and in what direction your prejudice flows. If it flows towards whites, then you're anti-racist. If you're being prejudiced against whites, then you're doing good anti-racist work. But if your prejudice flows towards people of color, then you're actually a racist. Ibram Kendi is even more clear when he says this. He says, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. So if you haven't connected the dots yet, under critical theory, the only way to be anti-racist is to discriminate against people based on their skin color. More than that, we should impugn people's character based solely on their skin color too. White people are guilty by virtue of being white. They have wicked and nefarious motives, and all their actions are corrupted by their evil oppression. Now, this ideology, this is exactly why I say the woke social justice warriors are the true racists. They are the ones who have a racial superiority complex. They are the ones who treat people in hateful ways based on their skin color. And they are the ones who want to show unjust partiality and discriminate against people based on race. Critical theory does not produce good fruit. It is bad juju. For the critical theorist, any disparity in any situation automatically must be read as racism. Oppression is the only explanation for unequal outcomes. This assumption is wrong. And it's not just a little bit wrong, it is murderously wrong. It's wrong in the exact same direction that communism is wrong. Assigning guilt to a class of people and seeking to punish them for the sake of equity is a deadly doctrine to embrace. This stuff is why we have people advocating for a different judicial system for Māori in New Zealand. They don't want equal treatment under the law. They want special treatment for Māori because they currently make up 50% of the prison population. For the critical theorist, this disparity can only be explained through the lens of systemic racism. Not gang membership, not broken families, not lack of education or unemployment or substance abuse. Nope, it must be systemic oppression. I worked for a year at a school where they had a board in one of the rooms with photos of all the PI and Māori students. As teachers, we were expected to write sticky notes of how those children were getting special treatment in our classes, and we were meant to go to this room and put those sticky notes next to their faces to say how we were giving them special treatment in our classrooms. I refused to do this because this was racism. I resent the kind of bigotry that says my brown students need special treatment because of the color of their skin. They are not lesser, and they are not in need of a leg up. They're not in need of special treatment. Some of my brightest students right now are Samoan and Māori. They will get to uni and they'll be able to hang with anyone. They will be top of their classes, and I detest the critical theory ideology that says that they need a leg up, they need extra help because of their skin color. This is white supremacy. It honestly upsets me that people might one day look at them in their uni class and think of them as some kind of affirmative action case, when in reality, they are some of the brightest students I have ever taught. The thing is, critical theory is a loser's mentality. It incentivizes victimhood, and it makes people want to be a victim. There is much to be gained under critical theory from being a victim. This is why critical theorists desperately look for racism wherever they can. They literally crave for it, these race hustlers. It's why Jussie Smollett faked his hate crime, and it's why microaggressions are now a thing. You can't find any real racism, so you have to go scouring for microaggressions. It's a loser's mentality and it's a victim's mentality. And it's embarrassing to see these race hustlers get away with this stuff. And it's even more embarrassing that white people are ready and willing to bow down at the altar of critical theory, abasing themselves, embarrassing themselves to make up for their white privilege. I love this quote by Thomas Sowell. I think he sums it up great. African-American economist, by the way. He says this: racism is not dead, but it is on life support, kept alive by politicians, race hustlers, and people who get a sense of superiority by denouncing others as racists. So how should we respond to critical theory? How should we respond to these ideas around race? I have 3 suggestions. Firstly, in response to critical theory, I think it's very important that we have a clear definition of what racism is in our own minds. When someone makes the charge of racism, we should ask them why they think that thing is racist, and we should push them to give their own definition of racism. If they offer the critical theory definition, we should point out to them that this is a very new definition, and we should explain to them that we do not accept this definition of racist. And by the normal standard of what the word means, they're actually the ones promoting racism. Second, we shouldn't accept oppression as the only possible explanation for disparity. When someone says that the New Zealand correction system is racist because Māori make up 50% of the prison population, we should push them to show that racism is the cause of this disparity. Racism in the system is why this disparity exists. We need to push them to show that. Simply making the assertion of a disparity is entirely insufficient. And third, we should hold firmly to this true definition of racism and point out when people are promoting ideas that are hateful or proud or unfairly partial towards people on the basis of race or ethnicity. We should go on the offensive. We should call out the racist, bigoted attitudes that want to treat people of color as inferior, treat them like they need a leg up to be able to compete with white people. This is not the case. God has made all of us in His image, equally capable, equally able, and people of color don't need a leg up because of these phony charges of systemic racism. We need to hold firm to what is true. We need to investigate the evidence, and we need to look at these things more clearly. I hope to see you again for our next episode, again looking at critical theory and some more of the ways that this ideology has impacted our society. I'll see you then. God bless.